Let's speak to Ruby Lott-Lavigna, political correspondent for Open Democracy, who's been following the inquiry. Good evening, Ruby.
Good evening, Gordon.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time tonight. We heard from Pete Saul earlier on, who spent 6.5 hours at the House of Lords. How were the dynamics for you today following this one?
Yeah, probably only marginally more enjoyable, I would say.
Give us a sense of it today then, because Michael Gove there accusing the Scottish Government of playing politics, wasn't he? But they would argue they were putting forward a formidable defence of public health in their own country.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a really interesting day because it's pretty rare to have a UK minister speaking in this module because it's generally focusing on, Scottish governance and decision making. So it's calling Scottish experts and civil servants and ministers. But of course, having Michael Gove give evidence means that you kind of get the other side of that debate. And, a lot of his claims were that he made his position on independence pretty clear. He said things that I guess are technically true, but are obviously very inflammatory, such as the political aim of the SNP is to destroy the United Kingdom, which sort of sounds like they're going to nuke the UK rather than just, split it up. And he also said that, Nicola Sturgeon often used the pandemic to seek political advantage. And you sort of heard that inferred in the clip you played earlier. And I think, he refused to say that, for example, Boris Johnson visiting Scotland during the pandemic was political point scoring, but anything Nicola Sturgeon did was. So, it was obviously his position on it was that the UK is an important union and that's what needs to be maintained. And when the SNP were working in the pandemic, they were trying to kind of push the need for independence in everything they did.
I think it's often forgotten, isn't it, that Michael Gove's Scottish? And, if there was anybody who understands the dynamic of the battle that often exists and always exists, there's no secret about it, between Holyrood and Westminster, it's him. And as you mentioned, he was instrumental in the independence referendum. He was huge in that lobbying of Mr. Rupert Murdoch, for instance, and his involvement in the referendum. So, what do we learn today about that relationship through Michael Gove and how Westminster and Holyrood were communicating?
Well, it's interesting when you ask what do we learn from Michael Gove, because he is a politician that is very astute at sort of saying a lot by saying nothing. So he comes across as incredibly diplomatic. He will almost go as far as saying things, but without actually saying them. And it's a very effective tool. And I think that's probably why he was put to the task of, managing the relationship with the devolved nations during the pandemic. And I think, he said his role was to, there were some ministers that were more sort of irritated or irked by the idea that devolved nations had different positions on things, but it was simply his role to, keep things pretty chill, pretty, amicable. But of course, whenever he was pushed on anything, it was very clear what his position was. And you're right, it's kind of funny when you get those moments of a Scottish accent coming out, because he does not sound like a Scottish politician, let's put it that way.
Ruby, that's a really interesting observation for me, because, say what you like about Michael Gove, this is his arena and he performs best, doesn't he, under these kind of questionings. And you've seen so many people flounder and struggle under the microscope of some of this questioning, but he just seems to be a bit Teflon in a lot of these arguments, doesn't he? He doesn't seem to be in any way fazed by it.
Oh, completely. And I think it's a flaw as a political journalist to just say, oh, wow, isn't he so good at speaking? And I don't want to say that, and pretend like nothing he says is important. But he is a good orator and he is very effective. And it is also his third time appearing at the UK COVID inquiry so far. So, this isn't by any means his first rodeo. And I don't think he is. I think the way he sees things is like a intellectual game where he is not emotionally tied to what's taking place. And this is a speculation. He may disagree personally. You'd have to go to him. Mm-hmm. But I think the way he comes across is that, this is an intellectual game and he's not personally offended or affected by any of the arguments that anyone else has made. But he, sort of sees it as a way to flex his intellectual skills when having these kind of conversations. And I think that's why he finds it very easy to kind of perform in this arena.
Yeah, Ruby, I wonder what your take is on this, right? Because in terms of policies and timings between Westminster and Holyrood, following the coverage of, looking back to the pandemic decisions, it looks like they were pretty similar. But at the time, my recollection of it was that Scotland felt like it was a couple of days ahead quite often and making firm decisions a little bit ahead of Westminster. Is that now just slightly wrong reflecting on it, or is that what we're really getting to grips with now that we're hearing some of this correspondence being aired?
Well, I think, you have to remember that sort of what powers the devolved nations had in a public emergency sort of changed. And so initially, they had to be given powers under the kind of Coronavirus Act in order to kind of input lockdowns. And the idea was initially that, or there was at least like a push and pull against like what technically was a reserved or, what the UK could decide and what was actually a devolved issue. And I think something that emerged today was the idea that what would happen is there would be a discussion over, when they were going to, let's say, ban mass gatherings, and then Nicola Sturgeon would go away and do it earlier than was like generally accepted to kind of, say, oh, look, we're better. But maybe, she also believes they should go earlier and that the UK was kind of dragging its feet a little bit. But I think, at least when there were conversations about care homes with Jean Freeman, it was clear there was quite a lot of parity in terms of like the management of that. In terms of care with care homes and kind of mistakes that were made, So I think in some ways, Scotland kind of painted itself as moving quicker and being more effective. And I think in some ways it was. But I think also a lot of the same mistakes were made because it was an unprecedented virus where people just didn't know what to do and had a limited number of options with many risks.
Yeah. And that's so important, Ruby, isn't it? We can get caught up sometimes in the theatre of an inquiry like this and how Michael Gove performs and how he handles questioning. But right at the heart of this is the issue of care homes, which is still deeply upsetting for a lot of people listening this evening. And the Scottish Government were under serious scrutiny today, weren't they, on that policy around care homes?
Yeah, completely. And there's, a really shocking statistic that came up during the inquiry today that was, I guess, gave the evidence like a lot of weight, which is that 50% of deaths in the first wave in Scotland were in care homes. And Jean Freeman said that she, will regret for the rest of her life any decisions or any deaths that occurred because of action that the Scottish Government didn't take or did take but could have done better. So there's obviously like an emotional weight, kind of the evidence being given today. But on the other hand, as I think is normal for all politicians giving evidence in inquiry, there was a sort of resistance to admit a fault. And when asked, was it adequate, the response, she said not as adequate as I would have wished it to be, which is sort of not quite saying it's not as good. But she said there was a complexity, that it wasn't just about people being discharged into care homes without a positive or a negative test, because sometimes that happened and there weren't any, deaths. It was also to do with visitors, and it was a trickier situation. But of course, if you speak to anyone whose father or mother died in a care home, I don't think they would see it as a complex issue.
Now, Ruby, a lot of the conversation I was hearing over the weekend in Scotland was about whether or not we will hear from the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, particularly in light of the WhatsApp conversations and Liz Lloyd's appearance last week at the inquiry. So what's the information, what's the intelligence on that happening?
Yeah, well, she's meant to be speaking on Wednesday, and I think we'll certainly see conversation about her WhatsApp messages. It's kind of insane when you think about it, that now this is at least the third sort of senior minister, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, and now Nicola Sturgeon, whose WhatsApp messages were missing. And I just think, if this were emails, a kind of format that had been used historically in a work context, there'd be huge outrage that these were missing, that these have been deleted. But because this is a more kind of modern form of communication, especially in like political terms, WhatsApp is massively used in Westminster and beyond, but it's kind of only most recently used. People are sort of okay that they've sort of disappeared, and I think Sturgeon will be grilled on why exactly her WhatsApps, didn't appear on the new phone she had, or where they went, or why she couldn't seem to get them onto her new phone. But we have had some WhatsApps, and that's from other people that she was speaking to, and those WhatsApps have been submitted to the inquiry.
And Ruby, can you give us a sense of that? Because, you know, this can be quite adversarial, and you talk about a grilling, but how ferocious, how tough do you think that could be? Because it is such a corner of this inquiry, isn't it, to find out what was really being discussed in those deleted WhatsApp messages. It really is a difficult one to circumnavigate with a reasonable and coherent defence, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, I've been reporting on the COVID inquiry since Module 1, last year in June. So I have watched hours and hours of this. And there is a balance that the Inquiry Council have to strike. And I do think that they can be quite forthright, but they also can't seem to come across as partisan or, too biased. So I think there is a level to which they have to seem reasonably balanced about things, and they're lawyers, so I guess that's sort of their job. But I think, this is Nicola Sturgeon has come under the UK COVID inquiry before, but not under a module under Scottish governance and decision making. So I think it should be reasonably heated, but also reasonably professional.
Okay, Ruby. Well, before I let you go, I know it's been a long day. I did have one question that I forgot to pick you up on, and you did hint, I did mention the Orkney trip, that famous trip to Orkney. I think it was July 2020, and there was evidence about former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's trip, wasn't there, today? And my recollection again was just how ill-received, how badly received that trip was back then in July 2020. So what did we hear about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, today we essentially heard that Nicola Sturgeon did not want to meet Boris Johnson when he visited, and and Michael Gove essentially confirmed that. There was also a conversation around a tweet that Nicola Sturgeon sent out, essentially saying, like, we should have independence. This is where we should be making decisions around our own country and not from kind of officials that haven't been elected by us. And it really highlighted the extreme tension between Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon. But we kind of already know that because we've seen messages from Nicola Sturgeon calling Boris Johnson, I won't swear, but an effing clown. And and so I think that there's kind of no ambiguity around that. But what was interesting was that Gove essentially refused to say that was, political point scoring. But Nicola Sturgeon's tweet about it was. So, it's fine when Boris Johnson visits Scotland to talk about how great the union is, but it's not okay if Nicola Sturgeon uses it to talk about independence.
Yeah, just one final thing. Sorry, I find this fascinating, Ruby, talking to you about this, because I'm just really interested in the discussions around the messages that appeared in all the papers at the weekend, from the inquiry at the end of last week. And Humza Yousaf went to great lengths to apologise profusely for the language that was used on those WhatsApp accounts. But is there any murmuring at all that any politicians in the SNP were doubling down on it, saying, well, that's what she thought about the Prime Minister at the time, and that's the language of work colleagues and how they communicate? Was there any kind of private briefing or dismissal of that as maybe far too robust an apology?
I mean, I think if you spoke to any politician, probably, kind of privately, they would probably completely understand the use of that kind of language. And it's probably something that's quite frequent within their own personal WhatsApps. Absolutely, in terms of publicly talking about it, I don't think there's any way that any SNP or otherwise politician would kind of justify the use of that language, because I just don't think on paper there's a way you can do that in an inquiry. I don't think even though to most normal people you could probably say, yeah, well, I got a bit angry and that's how I feel about Boris Johnson. He's a clown. But no, nothing to see yet. But I'm sure Sturgeon will probably apologise for her use, which has happened when everyone else has sort of apologised for everything they've said so far, even when they're being extremely inflammatory privately. Or
perhaps you could point to Dominic Cummings' language
yes,
and suggest that it was an afternoon tea party discussion compared to some of the language that he was using. But hey-ho, it's been fascinating to watch nonetheless. Ruby Lott-Lavigna, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Great, thanks so much.
Here we go, Ruby Lott-Lavigna, political correspondent for Open Democracy.